She thought she was just rescuing a starving dog by the side of a deserted road, until she opened the backpack he was guarding and broke down in tears. What could a forgotten soldier's best friend still be protecting after all these years? Interested in the story? Keep on watching and let me know where you are watching from. From. Sergeant Amara Lewis wiped the sweat from her brow as the desert sun hammered down, the endless highway stretching like a mirage. Her battered Jeep rattled over the uneven asphalt, the air inside thick with heat and the stale scent of sand and old leather. She had spent the last 8 months patching up soldiers on the front lines, holding broken bodies together with trembling hands and whispered prayers. Now she was headed home, orders in her pocket, yet her heart weighed heavier than her duffel bag tossed in the back seat. The desert blurred around her, gold and brown and endless, until something caught the corner of her eye. Something small, something still. She slammed the brakes without thinking, the tires screaming against the hot road, sending a plume of dust into the empty sky. There, by the shoulder of the road, sat a dog, not lying down, not resting, sitting, guarding. Amara blinked against the sunlight, heart pounding against her ribs as she studied the strange, stubborn figure. The dog was rough around the edges, matted fur, ribs showing like fragile architecture under his skin. But there was a strength in the way he planted himself beside a crumpled shape on the ground. Squinting harder, she realized it wasn't just a pile of trash he was guarding. It was a backpack. And something about the way the dog kept his body between it and the open road, the way his gaze locked onto her even from a distance, made her instincts flare like warning sirens. Her hand went to the door handle before her brain caught up. Every part of her training screamed caution. This could be a trap, a setup, something worse. But it wasn't the cold, calculated voice of the medic that moved her. It was something older, something deeper. That dog was guarding something precious. She could feel it like a heartbeat outside her own chest. She eased the door open, boots planting firm on the scorching pavement, and took a step forward, hands out, palms up. "Hey, buddy," she called softly, her voice cracking in the heat. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't wag. He simply watched her, his whole body rigid, as if the fate of the world rested on his ability to protect what lay at his side. Amara's throat tightened. She had seen that look before, on soldiers shielding wounded friends under fire, on civilians clutching loved ones in bombed-out ruins. That wasn't just fear in his eyes, it was duty. She took another step forward, then another, the hot wind tearing at her uniform, until the dog's body quivered just slightly, a tremor of exhaustion more than threat. She stopped a few feet away, close enough now to see the backpack's faded canvas, the weathered straps, the grime caked into every seam. And stitched onto one corner, barely visible under layers of dirt, were two simple initials. JW. Amara's stomach dropped. Something deep inside her twisted sharply, a shard of memory she couldn't quite grasp. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew this moment was about to change everything. As she stepped out, boots hitting the scorched ground, the dog didn't run. His ribs pressed against his skin, but his eyes, those deep, wounded eyes, locked onto hers with a pleading so raw it stole the air from her lungs. He sat planted beside a battered old backpack, teeth bared not in threat, but in desperation, as if begging her to understand. There was no growl, no bark, only a low whine, guttural and trembling, like a sound that had been buried in silence too long. Amara froze, letting the seconds stretch between them like a drawn-out breath. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, not from fear, but from the weight of something ancient, something sacred passing between them. The heat rose in waves from the ground, distorting the edges of the scene, but his stare was crystal clear. He was guarding that backpack with the fierce devotion of someone who had already lost too much. She took a slow step forward, hands still open, her voice barely a whisper. "Easy. I'm not gonna take it. I just want to help." The dog tensed, his body pulling taut like a wire, but his eyes didn't change. They followed her every breath, every twitch of her hand, like he was searching for a reason to trust her, or to run. But he didn't run. His body shivered in the heat, legs trembling, and for the first time, Amara noticed the small blood-stained patch on his flank, the way one paw stayed lifted slightly off the ground. He was hurt, tired, alone, and yet he still wouldn't budge. "You've been waiting for someone," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Haven't you?" A memory stirred in the corner of her mind. Jamal Washington. That wide smile under a too-heavy helmet, always talking about his dog, always saying the bond they had was thicker than blood. A lump rose in her throat as she dared another step. The initials. The photo that used to hang in the mess tent. Him and that dog. What was the name? Bishop? Banner? No. Blaze. That was it. Blaze. The name hit her like a flash grenade, and her knees almost gave out. "Blaze?" she said aloud, voice cracking under the weight of something too big to name. The dog flinched at the sound, his ears twitching, head tilting slightly. Not a confirmation, but not denial either. Her hand hovered in the space between them, trembling, suspended in hope. And then, for just a fraction of a second, his body softened. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't trust. But it was the first crack in the wall. And in that single, fleeting moment, Amara knew one thing with aching certainty. This dog hadn't stayed here out of fear. He had stayed because loyalty didn't die with the man who had given it meaning. Amara crouched low, her hands open and voice soft, every bit of training whispering in her ear. She spoke to him like a comrade on the brink, someone clinging to the last strand of a world that had already burned down. "It's okay," she murmured, her breath catching. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just need to understand." The dog's ears flicked, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts, and for a long, trembling moment, neither of them moved. The sun glared off the hood of her Jeep, the heat pressing down like a weight, but the stillness between them felt frozen in its own time. Then, with a sound so low it almost broke her, he gave a soft, broken whine and shifted his weight, just a few inches, backing away from the backpack as if it physically hurt to do so. That's when she saw it. The bag wasn't just worn, it was battered in a way that told a story. Faded canvas stained with dust, streaks of dried blood along one corner, a broken buckle dangling loose like a forgotten limb. But what stopped her cold were the letters stitched in the fabric, black thread dulled by sun and time. J.W. Her mouth went dry. The letters blurred for a second, not from the sun, but from the sting rising in her eyes. Jamal Washington. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in years, hadn't dared. He'd been one of the good ones, one of the loudest laughs and the quietest kinds of brave. And when the ambush came, when everything turned to smoke and screams, he'd been one of the first down. She remembered running to him, kneeling in blood-soaked dirt, trying to keep him conscious. But there hadn't been time. She had failed him. Now here she was, years later, staring at the last thing he ever carried, guarded by the dog he never stopped talking about. Her hands shook as she reached forward, hesitating inches away from the strap. Blaze didn't move, didn't growl, didn't protest. He just watched her with those deep, wounded eyes, and she understood. He was giving her permission. She took the backpack in her hands, feeling the weight of it, heavier than it should have been, filled with something more than supplies. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just about a fallen soldier. This was a message, left behind, buried in loyalty and blood. waiting for someone who cared enough to find it. Her fingers brushed the fabric, and the dog whimpered, pressing closer as if urging her on. Amara paused, her breath shallow, heart beating like a war drum against her ribs. The pack felt heavier in her hands now, not just from its contents, but from the weight of what it represented. Something lost, something sacred. With trembling fingers, she unzipped the top flap, expecting maybe some rations, a canteen, something a dog might have clung to for survival. But the first thing her hand touched was something softer, something reverent. She pulled it out slowly, a folded American flag, its edges worn, corners frayed, the fabric thinned in places where fingers had likely gripped it too many times. It wasn't regulation. This wasn't a ceremonial fold. This was personal. She swallowed hard, unfolding it part way, and felt a lump swell in her throat so tight she could barely breathe. Folded within the cloth, as if protected by it, was a photo. It was old, sun-bleached and creased, but still sharp enough to gut her. There he was, Jamal, kneeling in the sand in full combat gear, one arm wrapped around Blaze's neck, grinning like the world hadn't yet taken everything from him. Behind them, the sun bled through a hazy sky, casting golden light over. Their silhouettes. It was the kind of photo you took to remember someone. The kind you folded into your pocket and checked on every night to make sure it hadn't disappeared. Amara's hands trembled as she turned it over. And then she saw it. Written in small, hurried pen were three things. A date, March 17th, 2019, a set of coordinates, and a single line scrawled in all caps. If I don't make it, he knows the way. The air left her lungs like she'd been hit. March 17th, the ambush. The day everything went to hell. The coordinates. It was near the southern ridge where the convoy had been rerouted last minute. She had been in the third vehicle. Jamal had been in the second. She remembered the smoke, the screaming, the blood. She remembered dragging bodies, checking pulses, counting names. She never found his. They told her the heat had taken what was left. But here was proof. He had survived long enough to write this, to entrust his dog with a final task. And Blaze, he had stayed. Carried this backpack across miles, waited by the road, injured and starving, guarding his soldier's last message. Amara sank to her knees in the dirt, the flag clutched to her chest, the dog pressing into her side as if trying to hold her together. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Her knees buckled before she knew it, the rough gravel biting into her skin as memories she had locked away crashed through her. That date. It was the ambush, the one that had taken half her unit. She had been there. She had dragged bodies from the wreckage. She had tried to save him, Private Jamal Washington. But she had failed. She had thought he was gone. She had thought they both were. Now the desert spun around her, the heat shimmering like ghosts rising from the past, and her breath came in jagged gasps as the weight of it all pressed down. That day had haunted her in silence, in shadow, in the way she couldn't sleep without hearing the thud of mortar fire behind her eyelids. She remembered Jamal's voice, calm even under fire, cracking jokes over the comms like they were just another squad on a routine patrol. And then the explosion, the flash, the screams that didn't sound human. Amara had crawled through smoke, over metal, through blood that didn't belong to her. She had found him half buried, his chest barely rising, Blaze pacing in circles like he didn't understand why no one was helping. She'd tried. She'd pressed her hands to his wounds, whispered his name, promised him he'd be okay. But another blast tore through the air and separated them, and when she came to, they told her he hadn't made it. There was no body, just flames, just ash. For years, she had carried that guilt like a scar across her soul. And now, here she was, on her knees in the middle of nowhere, with his dog curled into her side, the same flag folded in her hands that Jamal had once joked would cover his casket if he ever did something stupidly heroic. A broken laugh escaped her, choked and sharp, the sound of someone cracking under the weight of too many what-ifs. "You waited for me," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Jamal or the dog, or maybe just to the universe itself. Blaze leaned his head against her shoulder, his body trembling from exhaustion, and Amara reached over, pulling him close like a brother lost and somehow found again. The photo lay beside them in the dust, the coordinates burned into her mind now. He hadn't died right away. He'd left a trail, a message, a mission, and Blaze had held the line, waited all these years for someone to pick up where Jamal left off. Amara pressed her forehead to the dog's, voice hoarse with unshed tears. "I'm here now. I won't leave you again." The dog, now trembling, tail thudding weakly against the ground, crawled forward and laid his head in her lap. Amara clutched the flag and photo to her chest, tears scalding her cheeks. She remembered now. This dog had been with Jamal every step of the way, their bond unbreakable. Somehow, against every odd, the dog had survived, clinging to the only thing he had left of his handler, a tattered backpack and a memory. And Amara, who had tried to lock that memory behind thick walls of duty and distraction, could no longer hold it back. The weight of guilt pressed down on her shoulders like a rucksack filled with stone. She had walked away, not by choice, not by cowardice, but by order, dragged into the next mission, the next wound to mend, the next soldier to save. She hadn't even attended the memorial. Couldn't bear the sight of Jamal's name etched in cold metal. She had accepted the official story, buried the pain beneath the uniform, and marched on. But Blaze hadn't. He had done what no one else could. He had stayed. No food, no shelter, no command. Just faith. Raw, unyielding, heartbreaking faith. He had guarded that bag like it held Jamal's soul. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why she couldn't breathe now. She looked down at him, his muzzle gray with age and dust, his eyes still locked on her with that fierce, silent loyalty that said, "You found me, you found us." Amara ran her fingers through his tangled fur, voice catching as she whispered, "I'm sorry, I should have come sooner." He didn't flinch, didn't look away, just leaned into her touch like someone who had waited far too long for a familiar kindness. She thought of all the nights Jamal had talked about Blaze, how he'd found the pup wounded behind a burned-out village, how the dog never left his side since, how Blaze could sniff out traps before drones even picked them up. They'd trusted each other more than any two people she'd ever met. And now, Blaze was all that was left. A ghost with 4 legs and a story only she seemed willing to hear. Her chest ached with it, with the shame of moving on, the ache of unfinished grief. But now, she had a chance to carry something that mattered. Not just the flag, not just the memory, but the promise, the coordinates, the truth Jamal had wanted someone to find. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, steadied her voice, and looked into the horizon. "We're going to finish what he started." Blaze gave a soft, low huff, as if he already knew. She whispered apologies she had never dared say out loud, her fingers threading through the dog's matted fur. The words came like a confession, raw and weighty, like she was bleeding out everything she had kept locked inside since that day in the desert. "I should have come back for you," she said, voice breaking under the weight of guilt and memory. "I should have asked questions, pushed harder, done more." Blaze didn't stir, but his eyes never left her face, as if listening, forgiving without needing to speak. The highway kept roaring behind them, indifferent and fast, life zooming past like nothing had happened here. Like the world didn't care that a soldier died. that his dog stayed behind, or that a medic had been haunted by a silence that never left. But out here, where time had stopped, where grief clung to the air like heat, Amara knew this was no ordinary place. It was a grave, a monument, a secret kept by loyalty alone. She reached down, cupping Blaze's face in her hands, her thumbs brushing over the soft gray fur around his eyes. He had aged in the waiting. She could see it now. Years of dirt, hunger, heat, and hope. He had stayed alive with no command, no shelter, just instinct and memory. "You're a good boy," she whispered. "The best of us." A lump rose in her throat as he pressed his nose gently into her palm, like an acknowledgement, a fragile nod between warriors who had both seen too much. She looked down at the photo again, at the coordinates scrawled in the corner, and felt the weight of it settle in her chest. There was something out there Jamal had wanted them to find. Not the dog. Them. Together. Maybe it was just a final message. Maybe it was a truth buried in the sand. Whatever it was, she owed it to him, to them both, to see it through. She folded the flag carefully, reverently, sliding it back into the backpack as Blaze watched with tired, trusting eyes. Then she slung the pack over her shoulder and stood, dust clinging to her knees, sun beating down on her neck. She turned to the dog and held out her hand. "We're going," she said softly. "Wherever that trail leads, I'll follow. I promise you that." Blaze pushed himself to his feet, unsteady but willing, and stepped toward her. In that moment, a silent oath passed between them, not just to honor the fallen, but to carry forward what still remained. They weren't finished yet. She lifted the dog into the Jeep, wrapping him in a spare jacket. He didn't resist, just let out a faint sigh and melted into her arms like a soldier finally allowed to rest. His body was warm but worn, trembling slightly as she adjusted the jacket around his shoulders, careful not to disturb the bruised paw or the gash along his side. The second she shut the door and climbed into the driver's seat, something shifted in the air between them. Not words, not noise, just a quiet agreement. They were leaving the place where everything had ended, heading towards something they hadn't yet defined, but needed to find. The engine rumbled to life, and the road opened wide ahead of them, stretching on like a ribbon tied to the past. She kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other occasionally drifting toward the backpack between them, resting on it like a heartbeat she didn't want to lose. Every so often, she glanced over at Blaze. His eyes fluttered open now and then, watching. Her blinking slowly as if confirming she was still there, still real, still driving them away from pain and into whatever came next. The backpack sat upright between them, anchored by the seatbelt, and it felt more like an honored guest than a piece of gear. Inside it was the photo, the flag, the coordinates. A life folded into layers of memory and dust, waiting to be carried home. The wind slipped through the cracked window, tugging at a loose strand of Amara's hair, and she inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, her chest didn't feel like it was full of broken glass. The ache was still there, sharp and insistent, but it was no longer hollow. It was full. Of memory. Of meaning. Of something unspoken finally seen. She reached over and placed her hand gently on Blaze's head. He didn't move, just leaned into it. A flicker of his tail tapped against the door. She smiled, barely, but it was real. Out here, alone with the horizon, she didn't need medals or orders or rank. Just this moment. Just this dog. Just this mission. Redemption didn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispered from the seat beside you. Sometimes, it looked like a dog who waited too long and a medic who finally came back. She didn't know what they'd find at the coordinates. She didn't care. Because for the first time since the war, she didn't feel lost. She felt found. And as the sun dipped lower behind them, painting the road in gold, she realized this wasn't just a ride home. This was the beginning of one. Days later, She sat on her porch, the dog curled at her feet, freshly fed and bathed, his eyes softer now. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the sunset spilled orange and gold across the land like a promise. Amara watched the horizon in silence, her coffee going cold in her hands. But she didn't move. Her gaze kept drifting down to the dog resting beside her, his breathing slow and steady, a rhythm that somehow steadied her own. She had named him Valor, because that's what he was. Not just brave, not just loyal, but a living embodiment of everything good that war tried to destroy. Valor was what remained when the fire died down and all that was left was love standing guard over memory. The old jacket he had once been wrapped in now lay folded beside the door. He didn't need it anymore. His ribs no longer showed. His wounds had started to heal, and for the first time in years, so had hers. Amara had spent 3 full days nursing him, walking him slowly through the house, letting him sniff each room like a soldier learning new terrain. He was quiet, careful, and fiercely attached to her shadow. When she moved, he followed. When she paused, he laid at her feet. There were no commands, no leash, just trust. Silent, earned trust. She'd submitted the adoption papers the same day they got back, walked into the shelter with a photo, a name, and a story that left the clerks speechless. They'd said yes before she even finished. No questions, just understanding. Everyone who met him said the same thing. There's something about him. They didn't know the half of it. Now, every morning, she unfolded the map with the coordinates again. She had traced them over and over, drawn the route a dozen times. The ridge, the ambush site. Something was out there, and Jamal had wanted it found. She didn't know what waited. Evidence, a message, maybe even something bigger. But she knew she owed it to him to look, to finish what he started. She looked down at Valor, gently nudging his paw with her foot. He opened one eye, then the other, and let out a small breath, his tail giving a soft thump against the porch wood. "Ready for a road trip, partner?" she asked, voice low and steady. He stood slowly, joints cracking, body stiff but determined. She smiled. Tomorrow they'd go, not because they were chasing ghosts, but because they were answering a call that had waited too long. On a quiet morning, Valor nosed open the old backpack where it sat by the door, his tail wagging gently. The sunlight streamed through the front window, catching the dust and golden beams as it washed over the floorboards. The house was still, the kind of stillness that came not from emptiness, but from peace. Amara stood in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, and watched him from across the room. There was something about the way he nudged the flap open, gentle, reverent, that made her throat tighten. He knew what was inside. He always had. The backpack had become more than just a relic. It was a shrine, a promise, a quiet reminder of a man whose legacy now lived on in fur and memory. Inside, tucked beside the carefully folded flag and the original photo of Jamal and Blaze, was a new picture. One she had taken just last week. It showed Amara in her worn camo jacket, kneeling in the tall grass, one arm wrapped around Valor, both of them squinting against the wind but smiling in a way that felt real. Whole. Home. She had printed it and slipped it into the backpack without a word. Not to replace the past, but to honor it. To show that the story hadn't ended in that desert. It had simply found its next chapter. Valor gave the photo a soft sniff before laying down beside the pack, his body curling into the shape of something long missing but finally settled. His eyes blinked slow and content, and Amara leaned against the doorframe, heart full and aching at once. Some wounds never fully close. She knew that now. But maybe they weren't supposed to. Maybe they stayed open so you could remember where you came from, what you survived, who you loved. She walked over and sat beside him, her fingers finding the worn straps, brushing over the black stitched initials. JW, like a prayer. He'd be proud of you, she whispered. Valor shifted, resting his head on her knee, and she knew he felt it too. That even without words, even across the silence of years and loss, something had come full circle. They had followed the coordinates, returned to the ridge, left a marker where the earth still carried the heat of memory. They had carried Jamal's story home. And now, they carried each other. She looked down at the pack one more time, then at the dog who had refused to let it go. It stays, she said quietly, not just because of what it held, but because of what it meant. Some battles don't end on the field. Some of the hardest victories are fought in the heart. And sometimes, just surviving is the bravest thing of all.